Good morning. I am pleased to share with you some perspectives from the U.S. regulators' experience with our digital transition completed in 2009 and some other more recent digital broadcast initiatives. The digital television transition was a project that spanned more than 10 years and affected hundreds of millions of Americans. On June 12, 2009, On June 12, 2009, the transition was completed when all full-power analog television service ceased in the United States. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. No, as someone who was at the FCC for the duration of the planning and execution of the transition, I can assure you it was neither an easy or smooth process, as these timeline slides may otherwise depict. So I am pleased, Mr. Secretary General, to stay and share with you this morning some insights from our experiences. Some important aspects from the first two slides I showed show the importance of having a whole-of-government approach. In the U.S., this included the FCC as the spectrum and broadcast regulator, but it also included other institutions like our Congress and the executive branch. We also employed a multi-stakeholder approach, getting input from industry, broadcasters, consumer groups, and state and local associations. This was very impactful to our process. At the start, we had nearly 115 million households with televisions in the U.S., impacting over 300 million people overall. One important factor from the timeframes is the importance of the presence of the hard deadline. This was established by Congress in 2006, and it was critical to completing the transition. Our hard analog shutoff deadline was February 17th, 2009. And you'll recall from my earlier comment that we completed the analog shutoff on June 12th, 2009. Well, it wasn't as hard as we thought it was going to be. It was a semi-hard time frame. We actually got a 4-month extension, which was very, very important at the time because as February approached, people felt they weren't ready, stations weren't ready, consumers weren't ready. So with this 4-month extension, my agency, the FCC, went into hyperspeed in our consumer outreach. It was literally a whole of FCC effort and a whole of government effort in terms of getting people out there, getting the word out, how this was going to impact consumers, and what people needed to do to get prepared. I'll go into that outreach a little bit later, as I think it's very insightful. We designed a phased approach for construction deadlines of the digital transmission facilities, starting with the top 4 commercial networks in the top 30 markets in 1999 and allowing 4 years later for the non-commercial full-power stations to construct. To allow the broadcasters, manufacturers, and consumers time to adjust, we required simulcasts of the analog and digital signals until the analog switch off in June of 2009. Happy to report almost all incumbent stations constructed their full digital facilities by the deadline, and only 4 stations out of the nearly 1,800 that we had at the time terminated broadcast service. By the time our transition completed, 98% of households were ready for the transition, either because they had a DTV television set, a converter box, or subscribed to cable, satellite, or another pay television service. When we talk about the digital transition in the US, the digital dividend spectrum was the 700 megahertz band, depicted on the top. This spectrum corresponded to the UHF channels from 52 to 69. For purposes of reference and general interest, I have also depicted on the second band the TV spectrum that has been reallocated to wireless services as a result of our recently completed incentive auction. This is referred to as the 600 megahertz band. I am showing this because many of our broadcasters will now have to migrate twice. So one lesson learned from our experience is that if countries haven't already completed their analog to digital migration, they should consider opportunities to make more spectrum available from the outset. Even if it is not needed right away, low band spectrum, with its wide area propagation and indoor penetration attributes, will always be in high demand for wireless broadband use. The remaining bands on the lower portions of the slide, below channel 37 and the VHF bands, are where the U.S. will be repacking all of our TV broadcasters as a result of the incentive auction. The following points will help frame the lessons learned from our actual transition, and I'll cover each in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to focus our efforts on the outset on something that we've been hearing from all of the other prior panel members, which is the consumer outreach aspect. From the beginning, the FCC focused our consumer outreach on those people and areas most likely to have difficulty with the transition: senior citizens, people with disabilities, areas with large concentrations of non-English speaking consumers, and rural and tribal areas in the U.S. Publications were an invaluable tool, including specialized flyers and fact sheets, as well as what we call the DTV Made Easy booklet, which was a great resource for volunteers and consumers. Throughout the transition, we established, updated, and enhanced our website with our publications, frequently asked questions, converter box setups, troubleshooting guides, antenna information, and reception tools. For consumers who didn't have internet access, we provided information through an existing toll-free call center. The call center handled 1.2 million calls in the last 2 weeks of the transition. And our lesson learned here is that having valuable and trained DTV specialists and call agents on hand was critical to handling this high call volume in the very last parts. We also established walk-in centers throughout the U.S. and also provided in-home installations, and we felt those too were critical to the success of the outreach, helping viewers in a hands-on fashion. I personally had staff from my office in the International Bureau who didn't have a direct role in the migration, deployed in cities during the final weeks of the transition, often helping citizens hook up their equipment. As noted earlier, the DTV transition in the U.S. was a multi-pronged initiative. It was not just the FCC as the regulator. Our sister agent from the executive branch, NTIA, was in charge of the consumer subsidy program, which was essentially a debit card with a $40 value that could only be used to purchase eligible converter boxes. Also, and most importantly, the broadcasters themselves spent a considerable amount of money and time on outreach efforts to make this a success. We often focus on the consumer outreach and the auction proceeds from the digital dividend, but I wanted to emphasize the importance of engineering tools that we used in the U.S. to map broadcast station coverage and to analyze potential interference issues between the stations. For both of our migrations, the engineering staff developed spectrum management software to aid in the transition process. For the first hop in 2009, they created a mapping tool that predicted signal availability based on address, which was an immense help at all stages of our transition. For the 600 megahertz second hop, the FCC developed a program called TV Study, which is an open source program that determines interference and constraints for repacking TV stations. This was used by the US as well as Canada and Mexico. All three countries worked together to clear the 600 megahertz band. As a result of our digital migration, we did clear 108 megahertz of spectrum that was reclaimed. 74 megahertz went for commercial wireless use. 34 megahertz was devoted to public safety use. The net auction proceeds brought $19.6 billion into the US Treasury. The major auction winners included the major telephone companies, Verizon and AT&T, who are deploying this spectrum for wireless broadband use. Now, those of you who know spectrum band planning, you know that the 700 megahertz North American band plan is not the most elegant and appealing band plan. But as an early adopter, it did help facilitate the growth of 4G LTE, not just in the US, but also as a global testbed. The map before you, one note, these are not all of the LTE coverage areas with just 700 megahertz. This includes other bands as well. And of course, the spectrum that we provided in our 700 megahertz band, along with other intervening spectrum allocations, still could not meet the demand of the mobile industry. So we looked for other innovative ways to come up with more spectrum. Through the incentive auction, the U.S., on a completely voluntary basis, reallocated broadcast spectrum to mobile use, which will now be used by private commercial providers to offer 4G and 5G broadband networks. In fact, one winning bidder has already announced that it will initiate 5G in the 600 megahertz band and has already turned on its first 600 megahertz LTE system. I mentioned this auction because it permitted a large infusion of cash for many broadcasters who decided to either sell licenses, move to VHF, or to channel share. They didn't have to go out of business. The $10 billion paid to existing broadcasters will be used to improve programming for remaining stations and provide funds to upgrade their facilities, which can enable other cutting-edge technologies such as ATC 3.0. This overall process had the effect of streamlining the overall health of the U.S. broadcast industry. I humbly suggest to this audience that the U.S. broadcast incentive auction could provide a good model for Latin American and Caribbean countries to do the same. To make things somewhat simpler, many of you have fewer broadcasters to repack and have not gone through an analog to digital broadcast conversion. Unlike the US, you could pursue your DTV transition while clearing 700 megahertz and implementing an incentive auction to open the 600 megahertz band in one step. This would avoid a so-called double hop, which is what we went through in the US, or requiring broadcasters to be reassigned licenses and migrate twice. Ultimately, with an incentive auction, you could provide the flexibility to allow your own industries to determine how valuable spectrum resources should be used, while potentially providing funds for your broadcast industry. Just last week, in perfect timing for this conference, Mr. Secretary General, the FCC allowed for voluntary rollout of next-generation television standards in the U.S., known as ATSC 3.0. The next-generation TV standard will give broadcasters the freedom to innovate, a freedom that their competitors and many other of these converged technologies already enjoy. Consumers can also realize the benefits of this innovation. The next-generation TV standard has the potential to dramatically improve free, over-the-air television service by delivering high-quality picture and sound, advanced emergency alerts that can provide time-saving warnings to citizens, new accessibility features, localized content, and interactive educational children's content. As you can tell, we're very excited about this, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this, as the next two speakers, Myra and then Mark, likely have more to contribute on this subject. So, in addition to the lessons learned that are listed on this slide, which will be available on the internet, I wanted to offer a few more. In particular, we felt that if we had devoted more time earlier in the process to anticipate post-transition issues, it would have helped us prepare better for the ultimate analog switch-off. Another point I want to emphasize that is a point here, but I'll talk a little bit more about, is due to the interrelationship of television service areas, we in the US were unable to design the transition as a regional switch from analog to digital service. Instead, we planned a national switchover using one deadline across the entire country. We did, however, have two test markets, Wilmington, North Carolina, and Honolulu, Hawaii, that were very instructive as to both technical difficulties and consumer outreach. In hindsight, having more and earlier test markets would have made the transition smoother, allowing us as regulators to spot problems earlier and take corrective steps as we move forward. For example, earlier transitions in a wider variety of geographic markets likely would have revealed sooner the challenge for stations operating on VHF channels and the inadequate antennas used by many viewers at the time. Compared to the more extensive testing done at UHF frequencies, comparatively less at the time was done at VHF, in part because most DTV stations were UHF in the transition period. Finally, if anyone here would like more detailed information from the FCC about any of the topics I briefly touched upon, I wanted to make you aware of our International Visitor Program, which the Secretary General acknowledged, where we put you in touch with our subject matter experts on any FCC topic of interest. This can be done in person, telephonically, or via video conference. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and to the CTO for organizing this important and timely conference.
Thank you, Tom. I think Tom has given us a very good presentation, and one thing we noted is that Congress, not the ministry, Congress established the deadline. So that shows the importance of the transition in the US. I know many countries battle constantly with getting ministers to approve only because there is no legislative backing for the plan, the programming. So that's one important lesson from the US. And we could see the plan, the 4-phase plan which they established, and the first digital transition, the second one involving the incentive auction. I think that should be one of the first auctions where broadcasters actually receive money from the process. We've also seen how much funding was put to the program. The FCC alone spent $130 billion, like I said, and their sister agency, NTIA, spent about $1.3 billion to support in coupons to purchase set-top boxes. So you could see active government involvement in terms of policy, legislation, and funding. And I guess that's one of the successes of the US program. He concluded by advising us the need to collaborate with agencies, a strong outreach, and to start early. So once again, please help me to give Tom a good round of applause.